I think one of the problems we face is that TeX and LaTeX are really enormously powerful systems. I mean, if you count the lines of macro packages in TeXLive, it runs into the millions. And there are scores and scores of books written about them. And they can be applied to things like doing advanced mathematics or writing fisheries manuals or typesetting multilingual documents. One of the interesting talks at the TUG meeting this summer was by a Japanese, that is a professor who is actually French, but living in Japan, teaching computer science, and he writes books in English with Japanese annotation in the margins. So when he comes to a phrase that might be difficult for a Japanese speaker that is in English, he can put in a side description. And so he's writing really in two languages at the same time. And his students apparently find this really quite useful. So, the needs of someone writing a document on some obscure language from the Indian subcontinent or from Central Africa are really very different than from someone sitting in my mathematics department trying to typeset a commutative diagram. And as a result, that power is often bewildering. Another problem we have, of course, is just a relatively simple one. There are a few characters in ASCII that TeX is rather sensitive to. Dollar signs, underscores, carats, percents, and notably braces. And a simple omitted brace or one brace too many, especially for documents where users have written 3,000 character lines, is totally bewildering to a beginner. And one of the things I hammer into students is you must get used to writing documents with relatively short lines. If your editor has any kind of an automatic line breaking capability, as many do, turn it on and keep your lines at 40 or 50 characters, because TeX issues diagnostics based on line number, not at byte position and file. And if you have an extremely long line with an unbalanced brace, it'll just be close to impossible to find it and fix it. You see, and for people who are used to word processors, they can't really get into this problem, because when they want to switch to a bold font, they pull down a menu and say bold font of particular size and style. And then they type some text in that bold font, and they pull down another menu and revert to a Roman font. And so even though the document they're writing has magical delimiters embedded in it that indicate the font change, they can't make a mistake in doing it. And so they find that easier. And that's a problem we face in the TeX world, that we really don't have adequate editor support that can prevent simple errors like this, causing people really a large amount of grief, sometimes to the point that they just give up, as they say the system is too complicated to learn. And without additional software that deals with those things, I'm not sure we have any good solutions to offer beginners.
I suppose there are some editors which help, but they're probably platform specific, and so there's no common one which everyone would use. I mean, Emacs can find your unmatched braces, for example, things like that.
Right. And so, for example, the LaTeX mode that I wrote more than 30 years ago in Emacs, when you type a left brace, it also types a right brace and puts the cursor between the two. And when you type dollar signs, the same thing happens. So that helps to avoid the mistake of having a missing one. But nevertheless, given that documents often get worked on by multiple people and in multiple editing environments, it's not a panacea.
I think you've hit on a really important problem here, Nelson. And it is just so discouraging to beginners when you get these massively complicated error messages coming up and you don't understand how they're related to what you're trying to do. You know what you're trying to do, and the error message you've got just seems to bear no relationship to that. I'll make some comments about things you've said. The first is pretty printing of text source could be very helpful. So even if the user has very long lines in there because they're used to a word processor or whatever. There's no reason why we shouldn't put that text source through a pretty printer and break it up into 70 character lines or so before we typeset it. And then the location of at least misspelled control sequences, for example, become much more obvious. And another part of pretty printing, of course, is providing syntax highlighting, which doesn't help people who are blind, but the same technology ought to be enabled to help people that are blind, so that the document becomes what's the word? Something that you can interact with, and something whose structure is very visible. Tech documents have some sort of tree structure. LaTeX documents have some sort of tree structure. And one ought to be able to use that tree structure to help the beginner when errors are made. I was in somebody on the blind programmers group said, what's the wrong, where's the problem in this JSON I try to write? And I put it into, other people solved it as well, put it into an online checker and found that there was an error, but it was hard to see the error because the parse, and what suddenly surprised me was that the error is completely obvious if you parse the JSON from the end to the beginning rather than from the beginning to the end. And I rather suspect a number of tech errors would actually be easier to understand if you tried parsing at both ends, or if we said, oh, we've started a section, so we'll reset the parser at that point. I mean, that's what the par does when you're not allowed to put a par inside a macro argument. That's a way of sort of catching an uncaught right brace delimiter. So there must be ways of failing more elegantly to parse, and online tools of that nature I think are worth developing if we have a place to publish them, which is in a sense is part of the community of practice. There's so much stuff out there, as Kelly says, that I could produce a perfectly good tool that does wonderful things and nobody will discover it for 6 months or a year just because there's no clear place to put these things and there's no sort of communication for dissemination. Whereas a lot of other communities have, you know, the sort of the grapevine and I think they're called the queen bees, who sort of communicate information, and then lots of networking. So I'm sort of saying there's a lot of chicken and egg in this area, I think, that a wonderful solution won't work without everything else being in place. So how do we get there? And the answer is I don't know, but we do it step by step. I think something that would fit into this is that Nelson was talking about the English teacher of computer science in Japan, and if there was if there was, so to speak, a sort of solid body of documentation for the fundamentals, then it would make it a lot easier for more specialist or more advanced works to simply refer to that documentation and provide links to it, rather than having to do everything again. So if I read an advanced book on number theory, I don't expect to be taught the basics of group theory. I expect to be able to, I'm expected to get there from somewhere else. And if the fundamentals of LaTeX documents are available in a good form, then one would want the documentation for the system you're professor in Japan might have an easier place to put their documentation and also improved visibility for it.